We're good to go, Craig.
Thanks, Ranju. Well, it's great to be with you all again, almost in person, and those who are watching simultaneously and those who will watch afterwards. And so last week, where we left off actually was the healing of the disabled man, the paralyzed man in Mark chapter 2. And I wanted to close that out by just giving some testimonies of some things Jesus does today with some people who can't walk. Now, these cases are for various reasons why they couldn't walk, but just to give some examples of that before we go on. Lisa Larios had reticulum cell sarcoma of the right pelvic bone, that is, she had hip cancer. And she actually was dying of it. It had already metastasized, it spread. And her parents hadn't told her she was dying, but her mom, under pressure from a neighbor, took her to a healing meeting. And it doesn't matter really so much whether you think healing actually happens at healing meetings in general, but in her case, the person who was leading the meeting felt like God was healing somebody's hip, and Lisa suddenly felt something and she jumped out of her chair, ran around. Now you could say, well, maybe that was adrenaline, but first of all, her hip shouldn't have been able to bear her weight. And secondly, it wasn't just temporary. She ends up pushing her wheelchair home and freaking out her father. And later on, this was on TV and stuff. This was I think back in the 70s or the 80s. And not only was she healed from the cancer, but where her bones had been eaten away by the cancer, subsequent testing shows that her bones had been restored. That's not something that can happen on its own. Barbara Cummiskey Snyder, doctors sent her home to die. She was paralyzed not from her nervous system, but her muscles wouldn't work. She had a very advanced case of multiple sclerosis. After 15 years, she got to the place, her diaphragm wouldn't enable her to breathe. I mean, she didn't have muscles to make her breathe. So what happened was she was hooked up to a machine. She had a hole in her neck for a breathing tube. And at this point, she said she was blind. She was curled up like a pretzel, she said. And the doctors had sent her home to die. They said she won't be back here again. She'd been in and out of the hospital for those 15 years, but they said, we're not going to see her again. When suddenly she heard a voice that called her to rise up and walk, but her muscles didn't work. She couldn't jump out of bed. She couldn't walk, but she did jump out of bed. And the first thing she noticed was that her feet were flat on the ground, which they hadn't been able to be flat. Second thing she noticed was her hands were no longer curled up. They had been curled up so much before, every couple of months, people would have to unpry them to get the dead skin out. Well, normally when God heals somebody, at least their muscles are atrophied. But in this case, God even took care of that. She ran to greet her father. Now, it was covered in local media. You may say, well, what did the doctors say about it? I have reports from all three of her doctors from that time. Two of them whom I contacted personally, all of them confirmed that this was a miracle. There was no way medically this could have happened. And that was 1981. So this wasn't something temporary. I mean, in a sense, all healing is temporary until the resurrection of our bodies. But she's had no recurrence of MS, and she's the wife of a pastor. And Bryan LaPooh in New York shared with me his testimony. He was paralyzed on his right side for 10.5 years, but at a healing meeting in Pennsylvania, suddenly he was healed and he began walking.
She already saw you open your hand.
And I have the doctor's report acknowledging this miracle. So at first he's walking with help, but he wasn't able to do that before. And then afterwards, he's walking without help. And we'll see him testifying about this just briefly in the next slide. This is his wife in this scene.
So I was almost like, we're not coming back tomorrow. So then,
Can you guys
so
hear
then-
the sound?
Then he said, and he went to you, and then I went to the bathroom, and I come back and he's on the floor.
Yeah, because and you came up to me, and I was like, do you need? I was like,
What do
was
you
it
need?
just the arm?
Yeah, because
But you were like, no, just pray for me. So I started
Wow.
praying.
The sister who's
and then you're
speaking
like,
here
put your hand on
is the
your
one who prayed
spine,
for
right?
him, Julia.
So I started praying, and then I was like, what are you feeling? Because I thought you were like, your face kind of changed a little bit. And that's when you said you started feeling heat. So I just kept on praying, and then you're like started falling. So I'm like, oh, somebody help me. And then these two guys came up, but wow,
But did
God
you
is
know?
so
Now you're
good.
walking in this $100,000
Yeah.
thing. I can't believe
I
this
kind
thing.
of figured it
Devil is
out.
a liar.
I'm a nurse,
Yeah.
so I kind
Oh.
of figured it out because I've seen that. I either thought you had, initially I thought you had a stroke, but
Yeah,
then like
that's
you
because
said
of the
the
right
next
side
side.
and the
That's what
hand.
everybody's
Yeah. Wow.
Paralyzed for 10 years. Wow.
That's hilarious.
Now he's walking and he's carrying this $100,000 thing out.
Two circles, right?
Yeah, he walks in bucket by
paralyzed on
himself.
one side of his body.
He couldn't move his leg.
It's been so,
So
long.
anyway,
I'm like,
this
so
is,
sick.
sorry, I pushed the wrong thing. Delia Knox. Now, are you guys getting bored with this? Do I need to keep going? Okay. She was paralyzed 22 years from an accident, a car accident. And this is public knowledge. I mean, you can go online and you'll see all sorts of videos of her earlier because she was a gospel singer. But she was at a meeting where they were praying for the sick, and feeling began to return to her legs for the first time in 22 years. So she asked, she wheeled herself forward and they prayed for her. Now, this time when people prayed for her, she could feel her legs. She asked for help in getting up, but skeptics made fun of it because it was captured on video, and they said, will you call that walking? I mean, she was moving her own hips, but she needed people on either side to support her because her muscles were atrophied. She hadn't walked for 22 years. So they made fun of it. But the next time we see a video of her is a month later when her muscles are no longer so atrophied. She's been working on them some, and she just walks right in. God healed her. So naturally, as you may expect, in the account of the paralyzed man in Luke chapter 2, verses 1 to 12, it results in God being glorified. Now, the fruit of the miracle shouldn't be objectionable to true lovers of God, but remember the scribes where we were last week. Those of you who weren't here last week, just to fill you in, the scribes complained because Jesus told the man his sins were forgiven. So Jesus demonstrates his authority by healing the man. Well, now they're not happy, and we'll see some more results of that. Although I'm going to skip some sections because we are supposed to get through Mark, I think by December or something. So I'm going to skip a lot of chapter 3 and part of chapter 2. But Jesus calls Levi. Now, maybe word had gotten around that Jesus could forgive sinners, and Levi is going to be one of them. So Jesus is walking by the sea. That's the same phrase that's used in chapter 1 and verse 16 when he called Simon and Andrew. And maybe Levi, who's apparently the same person as Matthew in Matthew's gospel, maybe Levi was a tax collector. Maybe his tax booth was near the sea because of fishing revenue. I mean, that was the main source of income in Capernaum. So in any case, Jesus walks by there. He's teaching the crowd. He's walking along, probably lecturing some as he walks, which I like to do in my classes, helps keep students awake. Can't do that for you. I can just like move back and forth. But in any case, the tax office. Tax collectors were viewed kind of like collaborators with the colonialists. I guess maybe the way we would see it is, I know some people don't like the IRS, but this is not about the IRS. This would be more like, let's say, Medellin, let's say Congo invaded the US and took over the US, and all our taxes went to Congo. maybe it'd be more like that in Judea. In Galilee, the taxes went to Herod Antipas, but he was considered a lackey of Rome anyway. So people resented this. You know, tax collectors, you guys work for the people who conquered us. So many suggest that he was a customs agent, and perhaps he was both kinds of taxes. There was a trade route nearby. They were very close to the border between Herod Antipas's territory. He's the Herod we'll read about later in Mark's gospel, and Herod Philip's territory. So it's just a few miles away from there. So maybe a customs agent, because whenever things would go from one municipality to another, and certainly from one region to another, they'd be taxed. And it was 3% at each one. And if you're just paying 3% tax for something that came from 3 miles away, 4 miles away, not such a big deal. But if it's imported all the way from China or India, which some things were back then, those fees added up, and you'd be paying maybe more for the customs fees overall that piled up than for what the substance originally cost. Ranjo, since you've come from India, I don't know, we should be paying a lot extra for hiring you since you've come from a long way. But anyway, the money
I'm
went
open to that, just to be clear.
You told me to say that, right? No. The money went to local treasuries run by the aristocracy, but that didn't go over well with the majority of the people. Fish for export, like we said before, might also well be taxed. And Capernaum had way more than enough fish in their fishing industry. I mean, they exported a lot of it, and then it would be salted in Magdala. So there was a Roman garrison in Capernaum, and so archaeology shows that. So maybe it was there to protect the taxes for whatever reason. But the hatred of tax collectors was not just local. We have a lot of tax receipts and reports about taxes, especially from Egypt. They've survived because of the dry climate. And we find out that a tax collector could search anything except the body of an aristocratic Roman woman. And often they extorted people to get more money from them. In fact, there's one tax receipt back then for 2,200 drachmas. That's like 2,200 days' wages for explicitly extortion. Hey, at least give me a tax receipt if you're going to extort me. So sometimes they would beat up old women to locate their sons. Hey, tell me where your son is or I'll beat you up. And we actually have reports from Egypt. And this is not just one case, and it's not made up. We have multiple cases where an entire village would skip town when they heard the tax collector was coming. Knew they couldn't pay their taxes, went somewhere else, started a village somewhere else. So yeah, tax collectors were not real well liked back then. Here's just a picture of a money changer. They would do that too. So here's what Jesus says to this tax collector. You know, sometimes I remember when I used to go out witnessing when I first became a believer in Jesus, and sometimes I would be sharing Christ with some of my peers who would be smoking pot or whatever, and some of the church people said, "Don't hang out with them. You're not supposed to hang out with sinners." And I said, "Jesus did." Well, you're comparing yourself to Jesus. Anyway, I did learn that it's actually easier to reason with people when they're not stoned, but nevertheless, I think it was good. You know, some people did come to Christ, and anyway, Jesus. Sometimes some church people, they get embarrassed when certain people come to church. Well, Jesus calls this tax collector to follow him. And I can well imagine that this didn't go over too well with the fisherman whose taxes he'd probably been collecting, and with a lot of other people in Capernaum. But Jesus says, "Follow me." Now, throughout Mark's gospel, following Jesus is a mark of discipleship. It's part of a call for discipleship. In Mark chapter 8, take up your cross and follow me. Chapter 10, he calls the rich young ruler, follow me. The guy doesn't do it. But Levi, he does do it. And we see throughout Mark's gospel, the disciples follow him, the crowds follow him, at least temporarily. But following Jesus is not about following us. Like, well, if you're really going to follow Jesus, you have to be part of my church, part of my political party, or whatever. It's not about following us. Mark 9:38, John said to him, "Teacher, we saw somebody casting out demons in your name." And we tried to stop him because he wasn't following us. And Jesus corrects John for that, because it's not about following us. It's about following Jesus. So Levi hosts a banquet in his home. Now the best banqueting places, normally you'd have like 3 couches stuck together, and actually they wouldn't recline facing this way, they'd recline facing the other way. I should maybe flip that picture, but anyway. And here is just an ancient drawing, an ancient sculpture of a woman reclining. So reclining was for banquets. Normally they would sit like I am in this chair, but reclining, you would normally recline on your left elbow, have your right hand free to eat things. And actually the way they would recline, your feet would be pointing away from the table. So the person to my right, say, could lean his head back on my chest. If you read about that in John 13:23, where the beloved disciple leans his head back on Jesus' chest, well, that's because of the way people reclined back then. So probably this was in Levi's house, which is also what Luke says. And it helps explain also why so many tax collectors might feel at home there, because this was a fellow tax collector. And word has gotten around Capernaum, Jesus forgives sinners. Oh, and Jesus welcomed a sinner to be his follower, this tax collector, even to the annoyance of some of the church people. And, often people who don't feel welcome in many churches, they still want a connection with God. They're still open to a connection with God. And if we can go to them and reach them where they're at, and love them where they're at, that can be a step forward. Here's just a picture of the kind of food that they may have been eating. Here's a picture of the way people would sometimes eat, although in this case, they're not reclining so much, it's too crowded. But table fellowship in antiquity, it establishes a covenant relationship, and it obligates the participants to friendly relations thereafter. So there's an ancient Greek story, I believe in Homer's Iliad, where two warriors from the opposite sides, the Greek side and the Trojan side, they're circling each other, ready to fight. And they get to talking while they're doing this, and they find out that the one guy's father hosted the other guy's father at a meal in a generation before. And they say, well, we can't fight each other. There's a covenant relationship between us because our families, somebody ate with the other person, so we can't fight each other. And so they went off and fought somebody else. But it just illustrates how heinous it was to betray somebody after eating together with them. So when Judas does that later, that's pretty bad. But here, Jesus eats with the tax collectors and sinners. And you can see why the Pharisees would have some problems with this. Because for Pharisees, one of the big things was don't have too much fellowship with sinners. I mean, they even had a rule against, if you ever eat with common people, you can assume they probably haven't tithed on their food. And if they haven't tithed on their food, you can't eat it unless you tithe on it again. So they were very strict about with whom they ate. And here, these aren't just common people, these are outright sinners. Pharisees and tax collectors are commonly contrasted in Jewish literature and in the Gospels. But Jesus talks about his mission, his purpose. He says, this is what I came to do. I came to call sinners. He had a mission. Many of you were raised in church. I wasn't raised in church. I was converted from atheism. I was converted off the streets, and people shared Christ with me. And so it's always given me a passion for this, because, like, wow, I would, if people hadn't shared Christ with me, I would have gone into a Christless eternity. I never would have known the love of God. Now, the people who shared Christ with me, they didn't find out till a year later that I'd gotten saved. They said to each other, I found out later, they said to each other, that's one guy, he will never get saved. Actually, I got saved later that afternoon. But my point in all this is, like in the parable of the sower, we don't know who's going to respond and who's not going to respond. Our responsibility is just to sow everywhere, share with everybody. Don't take it to heart when people reject, because people will reject. But remember, the good soil, it may be only 1/4 of the soils, but it bears 30-fold, 60-fold, and 100-fold. It's going to make a difference for so many people in the long run. By the time the people who had brought me the gospel on the street, by the time they found out that I'd become a Christian, I'd already led 10 other people to Christ. So hang in there when people reject you. Jesus' mission was to call sinners. That's what we all were. Some of you may have been too young to know it. Some of you may not remember when you were converted. But for all of us, you know, what we are now, it's by God's gift to us. It's by God's grace. And for the people beyond, it's God's gift for them too, if they're willing to accept it. And so we come to them not as people looking down on them, but as other people who've been saved by God's grace, who have this wonderful gift that we're eager to share, just like God has already shared it with us. So Jesus called this man. Same word for calling is when in chapter 1, Jesus called James and John and Simon and Andrew. And the term that's used for calling here also, interestingly, is also language that could be used for calling to a banquet or inviting to a banquet. So, hey, you know, Pharisees complaining, you guys, you're invited too if you want to, but I only came to invite sinners. You have to admit you're a sinner before you get in. Then there's this complaint. Well, look, the disciples of John and of the Pharisees fast. They're really holy. And actually the Pharisees, at least the ones who were very strict, they actually fasted like 2 days a week. And yeah, if you're diabetic, you can't do this. I mean, there's certain physical conditions where you can't do this. But everybody agreed that you can't fast when it's inappropriate. It was forbidden to fast on the Sabbath because of the need for joy. It was also considered utterly inappropriate for wedding banquets. What are you doing sitting there not eating? Oh, I'm fasting. That's not allowed. You're supposed to be celebrating. Well, Jesus says those who are a wedding can't fast while the bridegroom is with them. In other words, you know, my disciples aren't fasting. The bridegroom's with them. This is a time for celebration. It's a time for partying, good partying. But, you know, he's celebrating. It's not the right time. Now, when will the bridegroom be taken from them? What does that mean? Well, Jesus is the bridegroom. The image, of course, goes back to the Old Testament, where Pastor Jason has been talking about Hosea and God loving his people and his people being his bride. God is the bridegroom. Well, here, Jesus is the bridegroom. It's a hint of where the narrative is going. And he's going to be taken away. So we get a hint here of the impending passion narrative of Jesus dying. But it's just a hint at this point. Nobody's going to catch what he's talking about. But then he gives a couple illustrations of staying appropriate to the time. What's new has to be made for made new vessels, because some things, I mean, some old vessels, they just can't handle what's new. If you put an unshrunk patch on already shrunk cloth, when that patch shrinks, it's going to tear the garment. So instead of healing the garment, it's going to rip it. And the same with wine. Wine expands as it ferments. Well, you've got this wine that you've already put in wine skins, and it's expanded. And the wine skins, which are made of goat skin or sheep skin, they expand as much as they can to hold that wine. So as long as you put in old wine, no problem. But if you put in new wine, they've already expanded as much as they can. You put in new wine, it expands, it bursts the skins. And Jesus says it's the same way. You can't just tag me on to what's already happened. This is something new, a new phase that God is doing in salvation history. It's related to the old phase, but you got to have new structures for it. And the particular images that he uses recur elsewhere in Mark's gospel. So the tearing of a cloth, you have the high priest. I won't illustrate because my wife bought me this sweater and it wouldn't be nice, but the high priest tears his clothes saying this is blasphemy. Well, that's what's going to happen. That's part of the old order. And 1538, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. The temple wasn't going to be able to hold the glory of God now in the message of the cross. And new wine for new wineskins. Jesus talks about how he's not going to drink of the fruit of the vine again until he drinks it new in the kingdom of God. So anyway, I'm skipping ahead to Mark chapter 4, and just starting that. I won't get through the whole chapter, obviously. Jesus is teaching in parables. Now, it says that the crowds were pressing upon him. Actually, in chapter 3, it says the crowds were falling upon him, literally, and the demons were falling before him. So there's kind of a play on words there. But, I mean, Jesus was getting squished. Everybody wanted to touch him so they could be healed or blessed. And, you know, it's like they didn't have Zoom, where you could zoom in a lot of people at once without squishing the person. So Jesus has the disciples push out by a boat. Presumably, the Zebedee family still has a boat. Maybe Simon and Andrew still have their boat. So they push out a little bit. It's not far from Capernaum. There's a cove where you actually have an acoustic situation. Like here, you know, we have audio through microphones. And in a lot of churches, a lot of places in the world, we have microphones. But through much of history, people didn't have microphones. Jonathan Edwards would preach to massive crowds in the colonies, an English British evangelist preaching in the 13 colonies, and the crowds would be massive. Benjamin Franklin said, I want to test this out. So he went like a mile away just to test out to see if it was true. He could hear George Whitefield preaching clearly from a mile away. No microphones back in the 1700s. He had to project his voice. But George Whitefield also sometimes would be in the woods vomiting up blood. I mean, it was really hard on his voice. So I thank God we have microphones. Well, Jesus had a good acoustic situation here. You can have it if you're speaking from a mountain, but also in this cove. There's a special acoustic situation where you can go out on a rock here in the cove, and you can actually hear conversations of people in the cars on this highway. And they can hear you if you're preaching out in the rock. So it's been tested by people making measurements of this. So this is we don't know for sure this is where Jesus spoke, but it would make a lot of sense that he could speak to massive crowds from this place. And here's just a picture of massive crowds near a beach. So parables. The Greek definition of parable is really, really general. It doesn't help us a whole lot. It's just any kind of analogy. But the Jewish definition of parable, even though it's using the Greek word, the Jewish definition from the Old Testament of a mashal is a little bit more specific. It still covers a lot of different kinds of ways of speaking, though. It could be a story, it could be a proverb, it could be denouncing a wicked king, it could be a riddle. And Jesus actually tells parables in these different kinds of forms. Well, ancient Jewish parables, that was a common teaching device for ancient Jewish teachers. So today, maybe Jesus would have used PowerPoint. Probably he would have used something more dramatic than PowerPoint. I'm not the most technologically savvy person, but Jesus uses teaching techniques of his day to communicate with his audience. Now, rabbis told stories about kings, field owners, used a lot of the same imagery that Jesus uses. But in general, the later rabbis whose things we have written down, they told a lot more stories about kings than Jesus does. He has some of those about royal courts, but he tells more stories about farmers, because most of his hearers, guess what? In Galilee, most of them were farmers and fishermen. So also rabbis tended to uphold conventional values, whereas Jesus often subverts them. Those of us who were influenced by the Jesus movement probably tend to emphasize that more, and certain cultures emphasize that more. But anyway, Jesus more relates to the bottom up, speaking to the poor. Even though carpenters weren't peasants, he had good relationships with them, and some good relationships with some rich people too. But anyway, Jesus talks also a lot more about the end of the age and final judgment than the rabbis did. That was partly because the later rabbis were telling their stories after there had been a guy named Bar Kokhba, and he led a revolt, and they said, he's the Messiah. And he got killed, and so did a lot of his followers, and they said, he's not the Messiah. And so they, rabbis backed off on talking about final judgment for a while. It would be like somebody today saying so-and-so is going to win the election. You know, if so-and-so wins the election, great. If so-and-so doesn't win the election, then we say, okay, you are wrong. Anyway, so the purpose of parables. Parables were sermon illustrations, but imagine, you know, the pastor gives you a sermon illustration and then never tells you the sermon. Some sermon illustrations, you know, you can kind of figure out the point of it without hearing the sermon that goes with it. I mean, I remember one sermon illustration I heard back in the 1980s in one church where it was actually the associate pastor was speaking. He said, well, there was this guy named Irvin. I actually don't remember the guy's name. I'll just say it was Irvin. This guy named Irvin. And Irvin was respected in his community and in his neighborhood as a very upright Christian man. Well, one day he was pouring new concrete in his driveway. And one of the neighbor kids ran through it and got his footprints in it. Well, Irvin took that kid and just spanked him really hard. And the kid's father said, what are you doing that for? I thought you were supposed to be a nice guy. I thought you were a Christian. To which Irvin responded, that's in the abstract, not in the concrete. Well, you kind of get the message of the illustration without hearing the sermon to go with it. I mean, but normally with parables, they were meant to illustrate the sermon. There would be an interpretation that would go with the parable. I know some scholars say that's not true, but those scholars need to go back and actually read ancient Jewish parables. It is true. Rabbis usually gave an explanation with their parables. And so often Jesus gave explanations, but usually, well, at least usually in Mark, he tells the parable without giving an interpretation in public. If you want to hear the interpretation, come back from midweek Bible study. Jesus kept the secret of the kingdom for his disciples and gave others only enough clues to invite them back for small group or whatever. For example, there was a rabbi who told a parable about a king who needed guards for his orchard. So he chose one guy who couldn't walk and another guy who couldn't see. And the guy who was disabled in his legs, he could spot the thieves, and the guy disabled in his vision, he could jump off and scare off the intruders who wouldn't know that he couldn't really chase them. But he said, neither one of them can steal the apples from my orchard. But then they figured out a way to outsmart him. So the guy who couldn't walk climbed on the back of the guy who couldn't see, and they stole some apples. And when the king came back, they said, we don't know who stole your apples. It couldn't have been us. But he figured it out. And he made the guy who couldn't walk climb on the back of the guy who couldn't see and said, you sin together, you'll be judged together. The rabbis said, they gave this explanation, it's the same way when God judges the world. He'll resurrect us first. So our souls and bodies that sinned together will be judged together. Well, we come now to the parable of the sower and the four soils. And in fact, it's a parable about parables. It explains why Jesus teaches in parables. And the most mysterious thing is the beginning of his explanation, because between his public telling of the story and his private interpretation of the story to the disciples and those who were with him, those who gathered around him, Jesus says it's not meant for everybody to understand. Some things are only meant for the inner circle, for those who press in, because the crowds don't get to know it. And there's a little bit of a debate. Was this only for that time? Certainly it was for that time. I mean, Jesus, the big secret about the kingdom is that the kingdom's king is Jesus. The kingdom is coming already as well as not yet, because the king is already among them, Jesus. And if word about that gets out, well, he's not going to have time to teach his disciples anymore, because he's going to get crucified right away. So there's a secret, a sort of public secret, until Jesus is ready to get crucified, until his hour has come. And some of that gets unveiled after Jesus' resurrection. That's why Jesus says at the Transfiguration, don't tell anybody till the Son of Man is risen from the dead. And that's why, all through the gospel, don't tell anybody, but in chapter 16 and verse 7, to the women at the tomb, the young man, the angel says, go, tell his disciples that Jesus is no longer dead. So the kingdom, part of the message becomes less secret, but there's also some of it that's still hidden, because the world doesn't know who Jesus is. We can tell them, but they're still only going to see it through faith until Jesus comes back. So Mark chapter 13, verses 24 to 27, when Jesus comes back, everything gets unveiled. So in the meantime, there's still some hiddenness, but it's revealed a lot because Jesus is risen from the dead. And that's a pretty sure sign that the king really has come. God is moving in history. But this is a parable about parables, about Jesus keeping things as a secret. And it also helps us explain the obscurity that's in Mark itself. Mark's gospel as a whole functions like a parable. I mean, it's a true story, unlike, parables could be just made up, but it's a riddle that'll only be understood by those who stay close to Jesus. That's why this parable, over and over again in this section, Jesus says it's for those who hear. Let your ears hear. Be careful to listen. It's the same with the whole Gospel of Mark. It ends like, oh, what happened? We thought this was the Son of God. Look, he got crucified. And then it ends, according to the most likely reading, in chapter 16 and verse 8. With the commission of the women, they go their way, it says, and they tell no one because they're scared. Yeah, how can you end the gospel there? Well, Mark was probably the first evangelist to write a gospel, and so nobody had any rules about you have to go on and narrate the resurrection appearances and so on. But still, what a way to end. But it's expounding the mystery of the kingdom. That God works, yes, sometimes in very visible ways, like in the healings. But sometimes God works in the hidden ways. Because the climax of Mark's gospel comes in the cross. And what the cross reminds us is that even when you don't see God moving, even when darkness and injustice seem to prevail, God is still at work to bring about his purposes. So the riddle of Mark's gospel involves that. Jesus is the king, but he's not the kind of king that anybody was expecting. And the reader thus has to keep reading, going back, revisiting it over and over, pressing deeper, persevering in reading. In the parable of the sower, we're going to find people who, went in one ear and out the other. It's not enough just to hear. We have to really hear. We have to hear and keep hearing until we get it. So that's recurrent through Mark chapter 4, and it's actually based on this passage from Isaiah that he's going to quote in between the parable and the interpretation, which says that you know, they may look but not perceive. They may listen but not understand. It's not for those where it goes in one ear and out the other. It's for those who really listen, who really want to understand God's word. And so that's why I said, you know, about the midweek Bible study. I mean, it's not technically only for people to go to midweek Bible study, but it's for people who really immerse themselves in God's word, God's perspective, which is different than the world's perspective. Well, who's the sower? Well, Jesus has already been sowing the word. He's obviously the sower. But since the disciples would carry on the mission, that's stated a number of times in this gospel, it's also a wider principle. We sow widely, not everybody's going to accept. We can't predict who's going to respond, but the good soil more than makes up for the bad soil. The bad soil is those who didn't respond or those who didn't persevere to the end. So here's a picture. These are, again, from Todd Bolin. Thank Todd for these. This is somebody sowing grain by himself, another one sowing grain by himself. But you also, if you had a little bit more money, you could have an animal that would help you do it. Pull the like the hoe that would sow things. Jesus uses some commonplace images that his hearers would recognize. Most Galileans were agrarian peasants, and sometimes they sowed before plowing. Actually, they probably often did both. They sowed before and after. But the average return on grain in Judea and Galilee was somewhere around 7.5 to 10-fold. So 30-fold, 60-fold, and 100-fold, that's really good. Here we see somebody plowing with some animals using a plow. And yet some of it fell by the way, and the birds ate it up. The way may have been a little thinner back in fields back then because they didn't have cars going through them. Rocky ground. I mean, if you had a field like this, you know, some of your seed might scatter on the rocky ground, but there's also, in Galilee, there's a lot of limestone, some of it just directly beneath the topsoil. So if if it was a new field for you, you might not even know where it was or hadn't plowed it very often. And some think that Peter is later going to live up to his name Rock because he acts like the rocky soil, and that he abandons Jesus when trouble or persecution come. And here's just some more rocky terrain. And other seed fell among thorns, which represents the cares of this world and the lure of wealth and getting all wrapped up in those things. Here's some more thorns there. Well, I think we are out of time for this. So let me just say, I've been summarizing the parable itself, but for the interpretation of the parable, that's for those who come back to hear the interpretation. So, Ranjo, back to you, brother.
Wow. Well done, Craig. Can tell you've read Mark before.
More than once.
More than once. That was fantastic. That actually, and I want to remind everyone, we're going to take a couple minutes to ask questions. If you have a question, you're welcome. We have a small enough group here that we can ask it. If you want to ask the question, it's recording and you will end up on camera. If you want to type in the question, then I'm happy to read it for you. But you answered a question that I've had for quite a while about why Jesus is, constantly trying to hide his identity as Messiah, as King. And it just, tell me if I'm getting this right. It's really, because it always seems strange to me that he's doing these things and then he's saying no. Even like the parables, he's telling them because he wants them to come back, but then he doesn't. He doesn't want to say who he is. So what's going on? And it really makes sense that he was, if he reveals himself as king, he gets crucified immediately.
Yeah.
And so it's just the timing.
And later in Mark chapter 4, I don't want to preempt next week, but later in Mark chapter 4, he says there's nothing hidden except for the purpose of it being revealed. So ultimately, it'll be revealed, but it had to be hidden in the short run. And then there's also the complication. I mean, you see what happens when word does get out. I mean, he's crowded with people, and he wants to meet their needs, but the mission of bringing salvation to the whole world, that has to come first. And so he's getting crowded by these crowds. We think of celebrities getting, having the paparazzi chasing them. Sometimes we have to have boundaries for the sake of the larger mission. Sometimes we have to do what we know is best, even if it inhibits some things that are good in the short run.
Yeah, that's a good word. I don't see any questions here. I mean, this was a passage that didn't have too many questions in it, but I also wonder, does anybody have any reflections? Does this passage bring about just any thoughts or anything you would like to share?
Yeah, I do have something that I wanted to ask. Just I was thinking about the way that people approach things today. We actually seem to look for publicity, especially like maybe you don't see it as much here, but posters, healing crusades, even when you publish something, people want to make noise about what they are doing. So, and what the Lord does is kind of counterintuitive. It's counter what people do today. I don't know what you think of that, Craig. Is that?
Mm-hmm.
Have you ever reflected on that? That are we approaching this correctly, or are we maybe not following an example that Jesus would have preferred us to do? Should we be more private and maybe not even want to publicize some of the things we are doing?
It was counter to Jesus' day. I mean, when somebody would make a donation, a public donation, they would often have an inscription, a permanent inscription inscribed on stone to the public works to which they contributed, because they expected to get honor in return. And Jesus wasn't seeking his own honor. He was seeking the honor of his Father. That's emphasized more explicitly in John's Gospel, but we see it in Mark, where Jesus isn't seeking his own honor. He's seeking honor for the kingdom. He happens to be the king, but it's very counter to the way we do things. And I face this as an author because I want the information to get out to people. And I'm happy for the information to get out to people who will just recycle the information. They don't have to cite me, but I want the information to get out. But what publishers want you to do, they want you to market it, and they market it. And the unfortunate thing is that, and I think with healing crusades too, I mean, we want to draw people's attention to Jesus, but it's often the name of the evangelist that gets highlighted. And if that's necessary to draw the crowds, it is a warning. This provides a good warning to those of us who are authors, or to those who are evangelists, or any of us who are up in front of other people, to watch out ourselves. I was in some churches where actually there was one where I was an associate pastor. The church I'd pastored before, I was just Craig to everybody, but I was actually same age or younger than most of my congregation. But the next place, it was just part of the culture of the church. I was Reverend so-and-so, and I said, no, Matthew 23, don't call me Reverend so-and-so. Eventually I gave up. But in that culture, that church culture, it's not surprising that, it's not just because of Reverend so-and-so, but some other things where they would put the pastors on pedestals. Didn't always pay them accordingly, but they put them on pedestals. And it's not surprising that sometimes they fell off, because if we don't watch out, I mean, in the day of judgment, the lowly will be exalted, those who are high up will be brought low. When we stand before God, none of us has any grounds for boasting. And the people who've been in the background. Nobody's heard of them, but they've been faithful in praying for God's work in the world and sharing Christ in maybe their own limited space. Their reward may be a lot greater than a lot of people, other people have heard of. But yeah, feel free to say more if you want.
I think that's a good place to end. Craig, how about you pray us out?
Yeah, I'm still convicted by what Dwight said. I'm thinking, oh boy, I should get my name taken off my books. But anyway, Father, we thank you. Thank you for sending your son Jesus to save us who were sinners, who couldn't save ourselves. Lord, before you, none of us has any grounds for boasting. You came to us. You humbled yourself, took on the form of a servant. You came to seek and to save that which was lost. You came not to be served, but to serve and to give your life a ransom for the many. You sought not honor for yourself, but honor for the Father. And Lord, we pray that our lives will bring you honor, that we will not seek honor for ourselves, but that we will seek only for the honor of our Lord Jesus Christ, who alone is King in the kingdom of God. Thank you, Lord, for us being welcomed into the inner circle so we can know the secret of the kingdom. And we pray, Lord, you'll touch us, help us to share your message, and that, Lord, you will continue through all your people and through all means available to sow, so that our brothers and sisters yet to be will join this inner circle too and understand the good news of the kingdom, which is the good news of the King, the good news of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. Dear Father, we offer these prayers in the name of your Son, our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. Amen.